rights situation in the country. The Artegnos institutions at the national, state, and county levels have all been reconstituted, including the reconstitution of the National Legislative Assembly, the Council of States, as well as the state assemblies. I am happy to inform the Council of the security situation in South Sudan and would wish to affirm that the security situation across the country is relatively calm and peaceful. Some few incidents that you may hear are largely caused by the holdout group to the revitalized peace agreement. In spite of these ceasefire violations, the government remains committed to negotiations being mediated by the Saint Egidio community in Rome. Inconsequential communal conflicts that are still ensuing are being addressed by the government through dialoguing respective communities and with the use of traditional and special courts. Madam President, in March 2021, the government held an important workshop with the support of IGAD and UNHCR to find a sustainable solution to the problem of IDPs and refugees in the country. This has been possible due to the conducive environment where relative peace existed. As a result of the implementation of the RCs, the number of IDPs have substantially reduced given the safe environment created by the government for safe and dignified return of refugees and IDPs across the country. Madam President, the peace agreement, RCs, which was reached in 2018, is a significant milestone towards achieving stability in the country, which is now being implemented in phases. As I mentioned in my remarks in March 2021, the government commitment to implement transitional justice mechanisms pursuant to Chapter 5 of the agreement has led to the formation on the 30th July 2021 of the task force to oversee and coordinate efforts to implement Chapter 5, plus the technical committee, which will conduct public consultations to inform the design of the legislation to regulate the establishment of the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing. On matters relating to the permanent constitution-making process, the government launched a bill, the Constitutional Process Bill, informed by the workshops required in the RRCs, has been drafted, passed by the Council of Ministers, and now on its way to the constituted Parliament. Also, the government, in collaboration with IGAD, has developed terms of reference for the establishment of the Judicial Reform Committee that allows the parties and IGAD to select respective members to form the committee, which will then draft and enact a law establishing the Constitutional Court provided for in the RRCs. Besides, the government has just passed in September 2021 the Constitutional Amendment Bill incorporating RRC's articles into the Transitional Constitution of South Sudan of 2011. Madam President, to address the crimes committed by the people in uniform, some military court-martials have been instituted across the organized forces in the country, and perpetrators are arrested, persecuted, and sentenced. On communal violence and cattle raiding, the government has established an investigative committee consisting of officials, chiefs, religious leaders, youth, and other stakeholders to work closely in order to address the root causes of conflicts with the objective of ending communal violence in the country. On cattle raiding, the government has established a joint operation unit from the organized forces that has been deployed to areas affected by the conflict: Eastern Equatoria, Warab State, Greater Jonglei, Unity State, and the suburb of Juba. And in collaboration with UNMISS Civil and Political Affairs Division, the government mediated a peaceful coexistence among cattle raiding communities with the aim of resolving the conflict. As with targeting killings, the government has set up the community police unit in most parts of the country and has also established an investigation committee for the Gumba Shirkat incident. From that effort, 10 accused were brought to justice and arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced in accordance with the law. Madam President, the report of the Commission of Human Rights in South Sudan, as usual, does not reflect genuine findings that should be reflected to the Council as far as the steps taken by the government to implement the peace agreement and to address issues of refugees and IDPs are concerned, and others. You can now see from the Commission report of the 48th session and its exclusive alleged economic crimes and corruption practices in the country. Was the Commission mandated to report on economic activities in South Sudan? The government deemed the report of the Commission to be outrightly beyond its mandate, while selectively neglecting positive progress being undertaken by the government. In conclusion, Madam President, the government thanks the esteemed Council for adopting Resolution Item 10 for capacity building and technical assistance for South Sudan. This will help provide needed assistance in the area of promotion of human rights in South Sudan. But we ask for the removal of Item 4, which is a total distraction to efforts and progress being asserted by the government of South Sudan to achieve a lasting and sustainable peace in the country. Thank you.
I thank you, and I advise all delegations that the list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the presenters and to make comments on their statements. And I now give the floor to Norway on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
I have the pleasure of delivering the statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries: Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, and Norway. Violence and insecurity are the fundamental obstacles to improving the human rights situation in South Sudan. We welcome progress in implementing the peace agreement, such as opening the transitional national legislature, but the pace is too slow. In the vacuum, human rights violations and abuses such as arbitrary and extrajudicial killings, abductions, conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, and detentions continue. Peace should mean more than just the absence of war. All major armed groups are responsible, but the government of South Sudan has the primary responsibility to protect the population. We urge the parties to make immediate progress on arrangements to improve security and rule of law. We're deeply concerned by measures taken by the government to restrict freedom of expression, assembly, association, and media freedom in response to planned demonstrations last month. The government must show their commitment to civil and political rights by allowing peaceful public discourse to take place. Finally, a strong UN human rights mechanism is still needed in South Sudan. We urge the government to continue its history of cooperation with the Commission in recognition of this fact. Thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to the Netherlands on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
I am pleased to make a statement on behalf of the Benelux, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. We align ourselves with the EU statement. We thank the Commission for their important work and informative oral update. We are gravely concerned about the continuing and systematic violations of human rights in South Sudan, despite the peace agreement and the formation of a unity government. The military and the security system regularly violate civilians' rights with full impunity. Localized conflict fueled by the Juba elite perpetuates violence across the nation, with women and children bearing the brunt. We are furthermore deeply alarmed by the reports of extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detention and torture, which have a chilling effect on public life and civic space. Accountability and guarantees of non-repetition are essential to deter future violations and provide justice to survivors. This requires an immediate establishment of a Commission on Truth, Reconciliation and Healing, as well as the hybrid court. It furthermore requires a revision of the National Security Act to ensure it respects the rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms. Commissioners, what can South Sudan and the international community do to prevent further impunity at the highest levels of power? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the European Union for a video statement.
The European Union thanks the Commission for its oral update and its important work. Members of the Commission, we echo your concern that much of the past decade has been marked by violent conflicts and ongoing human rights violations and abuses. Your past reports about starvation as a method of warfare, as well as the most severe forms of sexual and gender-based violence, are among the most gruesome this Council has heard. Extrajudicial executions in Lakes and Warab states, as well as forced recruitment, add to our concern. The repeated attacks on civilians by armed groups along ethnic or clan lines are sufficient evidence that monitoring today is as vital as ever. We are deeply concerned about attacks on humanitarian workers and reiterate the government's responsibility to protect all individuals, including humanitarian actors. We welcome the convening of the Transitional Parliament and the announcement made by the President that general elections will be held in 2023. We are concerned about the perspective of a dangerous interruption of general dialogue among parties, and in particular the Rome talks, which recently have started producing some small yet important outcomes. We are particularly concerned about the widespread and systematic corruption. Members of the Commission, can you shed some light on the role that security forces, including the NSS, play in this context, given their links to the oil sector and the effects of corruption on the ability to enjoy social and economic rights? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United Kingdom on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
I am delivering this statement on behalf of the Troika, Norway, the UK and US. As long-standing friends of the people of South Sudan, we have welcomed the government's repeated commitment to addressing human rights challenges, and we remain committed to supporting a better future for all South Sudanese. We also welcome the opening of Parliament, a critical institution for debate and accountability. However, we are deeply concerned at unjustified restrictions on freedoms of expression and assembly imposed by the government. Threats of violence and intimidation by the government, including threats of use of live ammunition against peaceful protesters, are unacceptable. Civil society actors have been arbitrarily detained and charged with capital offences. These, Madam President, are not the actions of a government listening to the voices of those it serves. We urge the government to demonstrate it will listen to its citizens and to promote much-needed public discussion about the country's future, including by engaging in a credible constitution drafting process. We also urge it to ensure that this debate takes place without fear of violence or arbitrary detention. It must uphold the protection and promotion of freedoms of expression and association guaranteed in the transitional constitution, and we stand ready to support it in this effort.
Thank you. I give the floor to Liechtenstein for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Liechtenstein thanks the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan for its oral update and for its indispensable work. We are concerned about reports about the human rights situation in South Sudan. This includes the alleged recent wave of extrajudicial executions in the Warab state, in which dozens of persons, including children, have been publicly executed outside any judicial processes. It is every person's right to receive a fair trial, and children are not to be executed under any circumstances. Liechtenstein urges South Sudan to take effective and credible steps to strengthen its institutional capacities and to hold local authorities that deliberately exploit the system and commit such severe human rights violations to account. The rule of law must be upheld at all times, and human rights standards, including the right to due process, need to be respected. It is indispensable that all cases of extrajudicial and arbitrary killings are thoroughly investigated. This is the only way to provide justice to victims and survivors, as well as their families and loved ones, and to prevent a continuous pattern of violence. In this regard, we commend the important work of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan in collecting and preserving evidence, and hope that meaningful accountability processes will follow. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany for a video statement.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We are deeply concerned about repression and excessive use of force by security forces against peaceful protesters and urge the government of South Sudan to respect and protect fundamental freedoms. The systematic targeting and surveillance of civil society organizations, journalists, media outlets, and human rights defenders is deeply worrisome and violates civil and political rights. We are appalled by reports on sexual and gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence, especially with regard to the ongoing fighting in Tambura. We once again urge the government and all actors involved to act swiftly, to fully implement the revitalized peace agreement and establish vital governance and security institutions, as well as traditional justice mechanisms to ensure accountability and sustainable peace for the people of South Sudan. Commissioners, we would like to thank you for your exceptional work under difficult circumstances. Can you elaborate further to what extent corruption has impeded the state's ability to use its available resources optimally, including the protection of social and economic rights? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Switzerland for a video statement.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam. Switzerland would like to thank the Human Rights Commission on South Sudan for its report. We welcome the establishment of a transitional national legislative assembly. Despite the progress made since the creation of the transition government for revitalized national unity, the implementation of the agreement, the peace agreement, continues to be obstructed. The challenges to be overcome in the 18 remaining months of the transition period are considerable. It is essential to focus on key areas of the agreement and security arrangements, constitutional processes, preparing elections, and transitional justice. Switzerland will continue to support South Sudan in the implementation of the peace agreement. Switzerland is concerned with growing violence on a subnational level, as well as violations of human rights in South Sudan. We are particularly concerned by extrajudicial executions, which are carried out in a context of impunity. Civil society's space is shrinking, along with that of non-governmental organizations and human rights defenders, and this is also a source of concern. Madam, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished experts, what are the most urgent recommendations to ensure that the human rights of each individual in South Sudan, including the right of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, can be guaranteed? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to France on Zoom.
Merci, Madame la France.
Thank you, Madam. France joins in the statement made by the Transition Union. We thank the members of the Parliament, of the Commission, for their statement. We welcome the Transition Parliament, and progress made in the Peace and Reconciliation Commission is important for these to be, in addition to have unification of the armed forces to ensure the revitalized peace agreement and elections can be held, and these will apparently be held in 2023. This will allow for effective preparation to be given priority over the next 2 years. We are concerned with continued violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, including extrajudicial executions and sexual violence. We call on authorities to guarantee the freedom exercise of fundamental freedoms, including freedom of speech and peaceful assembly, and to allow human rights defenders and journalists to carry out their activities without fear of reprisals. France recalls the urgency of the humanitarian situation, which will require safe, comprehensive, and unimpeded access. We stress that any attack against humanitarian and medical staff is unacceptable, and none of these should remain unpunished. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Australia for a video statement.
Australia thanks the Commission for its update and continues to support its important work. Australia congratulates South Sudan on its 10th anniversary as an independent state. We welcome recent developments, including a reconstituted Transitional National Legislative Assembly and initial steps to develop the permanent constitution. Despite these promising signs, we are concerned progress towards implementing the revitalised agreement remains inadequate, including to achieve the agreed quota for women in government positions. Political infighting, internal grievances and community violence continue to deprive citizens of peace, safety and stability. We continue to urge all parties to take action to address the concerning levels of conflict-related sexual violence. Australia condemns attacks on civilians and humanitarian workers. We are concerned insecurity continues to impact humanitarian supply routes at a time when the country has reached the most extreme levels of food insecurity since independence. We call on South Sudan to support an open civic space, including the protection and promotion of the rights of freedom of speech, expression, peaceful assembly and association. Australia asks the Commission what can be done to support timely preparations for peaceful and inclusive elections. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Albania for a video statement.
Madam Chair, we thank the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan for its oral report on the very concerning situation of persistent violations of human rights in South Sudan and the impact this has in particular on women and children. We regret the increasing fighting in most of the regions of the country, frequently motivated by political considerations. We condemn these in the strongest terms. These menace peace and stability. We welcome the cooperation of the authorities of South Sudan with UN mechanisms and call on them to continue. Despite the determination of authorities in South Sudan to put an end to violence in the country, there are still no specific responses to it, and impunity continues. The humanitarian situation is still critical. It is necessary to respond to this. All the actors need to guarantee comprehensive, safe, and unimpeded access to international humanitarian workers. We are pleased to note the announcement of the government of the creation of a hybrid court, and we are waiting for effective measures to be taken by the court. We encourage the implementation of all the provisions in the revitalized agreement. And finally, the people of South Sudan are legitimately hoping for a climate of peace and security. We call for real accounts to be made and ask that the system of impunity be put an end, be finished. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Venezuela for a video statement.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Venezuela reiterates the fact that we condemn the politicization and selectivity that mark the meddling nature of initiatives against specific countries promoted by this Council, which do not have the consent of the country concerned. Therefore, Venezuela voted against Resolution 46/23 against South Sudan, which gave rise to this debate. South Sudan has gone through complex situations, but the country has made good progress along the path of dialogue and understanding towards the sought-after peace and reconciliation that are necessary in order to improve the human rights situation of its people. We must continue supporting the inclusive process of national dialogue as well as the implementation of the revitalized agreement. We need to cooperate constructively with the Commission of the African Union, with the High Representative of the African Union for South Sudan, and with the institutions created pursuant to the revitalized agreement. We will continue to oppose the attempts by some countries to convert this Council into a stage for confrontation using human rights as a tool for political pressure against developing countries. Relations between states need to be based on the universal principles of respect for sovereignty, the free self-determination of peoples, and non-interference in the internal affairs of states, all of which is enshrined in the UN Charter. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the United States for a video statement.
We thank the Commission for working to address South Sudan's grave human rights situation. July marked South Sudan's 10th anniversary as a country, but there was little to celebrate. South Sudan's leaders have plundered its resources and stoked conflict. Reports of human rights violations and abuses may now be as prevalent as during the independence struggle, including reports of pervasive sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary arrests and detentions, and excessive restrictions on freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly. We condemn the ongoing crackdown on civil society and the attacks on humanitarian workers, which continue and remain unaddressed by the government. Transitional justice mechanisms must be fully established. The people of South Sudan need to be given an opportunity to choose their own government through an inclusive constitution drafting process and free and fair elections by mid-2023. My question is this: what can be done to reduce the likelihood of renewed mass atrocities in South Sudan?
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Russian Federation for a video statement.
President, the formation of the Transitional Government of National Unity in South Sudan has created the necessary conditions for helping the country towards political stability and national reconciliation. We welcome the measures taken by the country's leadership on key issues of peace building, including the appointment of governments for states and governing bodies for counties. We note the start of the work of the National Transitional Legislative Assembly and Council of States. We look forward to further work in terms of training and forming united armed forces in South Sudan, and we call on all those who haven't signed the revisited agreement on solving the South Sudanese conflict to join the state-building process. We would like to give due credit to the mediation work done by the African Union and the Intergovernmental Agency for Development, which foster the implementation of specific provisions of the revisited agreement. We are concerned by intercommunal armed clashes in a number of areas of the country, and we firmly condemn any attempts to breach the revisited agreement, acts of violence against civilians, including those who work for humanitarian organizations in the country. We welcome the agreement between South Sudan and Uganda on jointly patrolling the road between Imule and Juba, given the attacks that have taken place there. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Ireland for a video statement.
Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU. We thank the Commission for its update and for its continued efforts in documenting the human rights situation in South Sudan. We remain deeply concerned by the dire humanitarian and human rights situation in South Sudan. We are disturbed by the increased levels of subnational violence and displacement, particularly around Tambura, where it is believed that the majority of those killed recently were women and children. Ireland is also concerned by the alarming levels of food insecurity, often driven by conflict and ongoing attacks on humanitarian workers. The endemic levels of sexual and gender-based violence in the country are unacceptable and must end. In this regard, Ireland welcomes the launch of the Joint Action Plan for the Armed Forces on addressing conflict related to sexual violence. Protection of civilians is central to the peace agreement and must be a priority for the government. Ireland calls for a renewed commitment from the government to fully implement the peace agreement, including ensuring that the quota for women's participation is met across the institutions and that this participation is full, equal and meaningful. We also emphasise the need for a vibrant and protected civil society space to be in place before elections can be held. Members of the Commission, we are concerned that progress towards the establishment of a transitional justice mechanism, including the hybrid court, seems to have completely stalled. How can the international community best support progress in this critical area? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to China for a video statement.
Madam President, thanks to the active mediation of the international community, significant progress has been made in the peace process in South Sudan since last year, which conforms to the fundamental interests of South Sudanese people and conduces to promoting and protecting their human rights. China welcomes this development and has always taken an active part in the peace process in South Sudan and is ready to continue its assistance within its means for the economic and social development of South Sudan. China is ready to work with the international community in our joint efforts to promote political transition and alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the country. China has always advocated a constructive dialogue and cooperation on human rights issues and has opposed politicization and public pressuring over human rights issues. China appreciates the efforts made by the South Sudanese government in promoting and protecting human rights and calls on the international community to show full understanding of the challenges facing South Sudan in human rights protection and economic and social development, and to provide assistance according to the needs of the government and people of the country. The Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan was created without consent of the concerned country. Its work has been marred by prejudices, adding to the complexities of the political transition process in the country. The Human Rights Council should terminate the mandate of the Commission. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United Kingdom for a video statement.
President, the United Kingdom thanks the Commission for its work in South Sudan. We welcome the Government of South Sudan's commitments to address human rights concerns and recent progress on implementation of the 2018 peace agreement. However, 10 years since independence and 3 years since the agreement was signed, progress falls well below expectations. South Sudanese people continue to suffer severely as a result of violence, displacement, attacks on humanitarian workers, sexual and gender-based violence, and arbitrary detentions. The UK is deeply concerned at restrictions on freedom of expression in response to recent calls for peaceful protest. Governments must listen to grievances and allow, indeed encourage, dialogue without fear. Given this and continued wider abuses, we urge the Government of South Sudan to deliver on their commitments on transitional justice and accountability, and uphold the protections and promotions of freedom of speech guaranteed in the transitional constitution. It is clear that robust monitoring, particularly through the continuation of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, also remains essential to support urgent human rights improvements. Members of the Commission, what action can the international community take to protect civilians and their freedom of speech, as well as to protect NGOs and humanitarians? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sri Lanka for a video statement.
Madam President, Sri Lanka stresses that initiatives and mandates which do not enjoy the consent of the country concerned are confrontational and counterproductive. We appreciate the progress made by South Sudan in recent years in matters such as the reduction in the number of IDPs and other measures aimed at post-conflict recovery. We welcome the drafting of a new constitution for South Sudan and all measures taken towards achieving peace and reconciliation. Retaining South Sudan under this agenda item, irrespective of the wishes of the country concerned, will be counterproductive and contrary to the spirit of General Assembly Resolution 60/251. We consider it important that the Council and the international community accords due recognition to South Sudan's efforts and engages constructively and plays a positive role in the efforts at restoring normalcy and reconciliation through initiatives voluntarily undertaken by the government of South Sudan with the support of the African Union. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. Our observations and debates on the specific countries in the Human Rights Council often deviate from the principles and code of conduct mandated, thereby damaging the credibility of the human rights mechanism as a whole. We are of the view that any debate based on prejudice is not conducive but counterproductive to the genuine protection of human rights, and therefore such practice should be discontinued. The genuine willingness and preparedness of the government of South Sudan for the promotion and protection of human rights and its efforts to preserve the peace and stability of the country should be duly taken into account and further encouraged. The HRC and OHCHR should avoid application of politicization, selectivity, and double standards in the fields of human rights, and encourage the constructive dialogue and cooperation to promote understanding of the different realities and to explore effective way for the promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran on Zoom.
Madam President, the Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates the need for this Council to fulfill its mandate on promotion and protection of human rights on the basis of dialogue and cooperation. The principle of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues should always be the Council's guiding pillars. Madam President, we listened attentively to His Excellency Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs of Republic of South Sudan. We are delighted to note the high level of commitment conveyed by the government of South Sudan to implement a peace agreement and to bring a lasting and sustainable peace in the country. The international community should support that commitment. We also noted that South Sudan does not see the resolution under Item 4 as helpful and regarded as the distraction from progress being made. The international community should attend to this call. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And it has been brought to my attention that the delegation of Eritrea has requested to take the floor after the closure of the list of speakers for this debate. If there is no objection, I intend to allow the delegation to take the floor. I see no objection. I give the floor to Eritrea. Eritrea, you have the floor. Could I ask the delegation of Eritrea just to unmute yourself, please? We can't hear you. Thank you. If all is well with the sound, could I ask the delegation to start from the beginning, please? We didn't hear any of your intervention. Thank you. I'm sorry, we're still not getting a sound, and perhaps after we have completed the list for non-government organizations, we can revert to Eritrea. I'm now going to turn to our list of non-government organizations, and I give the floor to Civicus.
Civicus and its partners in South Sudan thank the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan for their update and this crucial continued scrutiny. We welcome steps taken to implement the recommendation of the revitalized peace agreement. However, its implementation continues to be slow. Despite renewed commitment towards the formation of the government of national unity, there is no improvement in human rights situation. The dire humanitarian, food security, and economic conditions in the country continue to have an enormous detrimental effect on civilians. Localized violence continues unabated in many parts of the country. We are gravely concerned by the reports of extrajudicial executions carried out by government forces in Warrap state in July. At least 42 people. 13 people were arbitrarily executed in June at the instruction of state officials in Quebec and Rumbek. Civic space is closed with independent and critical voices, including human rights defenders, particularly targeted. The Commission has highlighted the troubling practice of surveillance of journalists and activities to instill fear. We continue to see restrictions on freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, arbitrary arrest and detention, and sexual violence. The current arrests of activists in crackdown on peaceful protests in South Sudan is troubling. We call on the South Sudan government to take concrete steps to ensure human security and protection of human rights. We ask the Commission what are the next steps that the Council and Member States do to further accountability, as well as to enhance protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Madam President, members of the Commission, 10 years after independence, South Sudan needs utmost attention. The mandate of the Commission remains vital. Next March, the Council should extend it further. We remain concerned over local-level conflict, SGBV, extrajudicial killings, and attacks against civilians. South Sudanese are longing for peace, national cohesion, and accountability. We are deeply concerned over the pressure faced by independent human rights, civil society, and the peace-building actors in the country. HRD is working to advance justice, accountability, and governance are subject to pervasive surveillance. Despite continuous effort to facilitate dialogue between CSOs and government officials, violations continue. They are facilitated by a culture of intimidation, power abuse, and impunity. Last March, security agents tortured peaceful protesters who demanded justice for an artist who died due to negligence and poor state of health services. Last July, national security agents stormed and shut down a civil society discussion meant to popularize the constitution. On 30th August, there were rampant arrests of civil society members across the country. In Yei, 3 of those arrested are still incarcerated. Internet was shut down, and in Jungle Estate, a community radio was closed. We call on the government to cease the harassment of HRDs and civil society actors, release those being detained for engaging in human rights activities, and ensure investigation into attacks against HRDs. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Amnesty International.
Madam President, we thank the Commission for their update. We remain concerned about the government's targeting of the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, association and peaceful assembly, including a new wave of repression in response to calls for peaceful protests. Between 2nd and 30th August, government actors arbitrarily arrested at least 14 people in relation to the planned peaceful protests, closed a local think tank group and a radio station, increased surveillance of suspected protesters and organizers, and heavily deployed security forces, obstructing the planned protests and forcing civil society actors into hiding for fear of arrest. At least 5 arbitrarily arrested individuals remain detained. In Yei, 4 civilians remain held in a military intelligence detention facility with limited to no access to their lawyer. The authorities continue to hold a founder of a political action group calling for the peaceful protests at Juba Central Prison. On the eve of the protests, we documented internet disruptions that lasted until the end of the day, when the failed protests were to take place. We suspect that the internet shutdown may have been a deliberate attempt by the authorities to derail the protests. In the week after the aborted protests, we received more reports of harassment of civil society actors across the country. Madam President, we urge this Council to establish robust human rights benchmarks that the government must meet before the Council will consider any amendment to the Commission's mandate. We would like to ask the Commissioners to list minimal steps the government can take to fulfill their obligations with respect to rights to freedom of opinion and expression and peaceful assembly. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Rencontre Africaine pour la défense des droits de l'homme.
Madam President, RADO welcomes the oral update by the Commission on Human Rights on South Sudan and commends some positive signs in the promotion of social justice, such as progress in the promotion of political participation of women in parliament, with the recent appointment on the 2nd of August, the first female speaker of the Transnational Legislative Assembly, as well as the female deputy speaker of the Council of States. However, 10 years since independence and 3 years since the signing of the peace agreement, the situation in South Sudan remains fragile. It is disappointing given the continued peace process, including the international and regional communities, that fighting has not completely ceased, and a substantial level by the fractions within opposition and forces loyal to the president. Civilians bear the brunt of the ongoing insecurity. Since the beginning of the conflict in 2013, it is estimated that around 2.4 million refugees have fled, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. Furthermore, there has been more than a dozen of aid workers mercilessly killed in 2018, bringing the total number to more than 100. In conclusion, RADO put forward the following questions to the Commission. What immediate steps and processes do you regard as necessary by the unity government to ensure probability of advancing national cohesion and sustainable peace?
Thank you. I give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
President. South Sudanese continue to live in a context of widespread impunity and insecurity which threatens the enjoyment of their most fundamental human rights and highlights the ongoing need for Council scrutiny. We welcome the Commission's recent findings exposing widespread corruption and embezzlement of public funds by government officials, which deprives the South Sudanese people of critical funding and undermines the government's ability to meet the needs of the millions who are currently food insecure and to protect the rights to health and education. Impunity for serious crimes under international law is the norm. We remain seriously concerned that South Sudan's authorities are not prepared to live up to their commitments under the revitalized accord to ensure perpetrators are held to criminal account fairly. The government and the African Union Commission have yet to finalize the establishment of the hybrid court. Repression of domestic dissent is on the rise. Since July, following calls for peaceful protests by a civic action coalition, the authorities detained political activists, shut down a think tank linked to the coalition, harassed the press, and threatened to use live ammunition against protesters. Security forces in Warrap State, under the orders of the state governor, summarily executed at least 8 suspected criminals, including 2 children, as part of an anti-crime campaign. The UN peacekeeping mission documented similar patterns of arbitrary arrests and extrajudicial killings in both Warrap and Lake states. Against this backdrop, robust international monitoring and reporting by the Commission, along with concerted efforts to ensure their recommendations are implemented, remain critical. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Mizan Center for Human Rights.
Thank you. We welcome the High Commissioner's oral update on the human rights situation in South Sudan and the country's ratification of the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict back in 2018. We are grateful for the government's recent improvements in the demobilization of children from armed forces. However, we remain concerned about the alarming number of children still trapped in those various conflicts and their abduction committed by the NIS forces as means of warfare. We urge South Sudan and international human rights actors to conduct thorough investigation during clashes to ensure that no children are either killed or mistreated. Furthermore, Mizan Center for Human Rights and Geneva International Center for Justice cannot stress enough on the urgency for the international community to cooperate and communicate to find rapid and plausible solutions to the growing famine across the country. With about 1.4 million children suffering from acute malnutrition and nearly 7 million individuals in total struggling to have enough food daily. Additionally, we're deeply concerned about the remaining number of attacks on aid and humanitarian workers. Since last January, at least 7 aid workers have been killed and at least 120 since the civil war broke back in 2013. Essential services such as health and education are dependent on humanitarian actors. South Sudan needs to comply by its international obligations under human rights and humanitarian law, as highlighted by the Council's resolution of 2021. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada.
Madam President, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada thanks the Commission for its oral report. We are deeply concerned by the continued pattern of widespread human rights violations against human rights defenders in South Sudan, including repression of their rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. South Sudan has still not investigated or ensured accountability for the 2017 disappearances and murders of human rights lawyer Dong Samuel Luak and opposition politician Agri Idri. Both were kidnapped from Nairobi in January 2017 by South Sudan's National Security Service. In 2019, the UN panel of experts on South Sudan found it highly probable that they were executed at an NSS training facility on January 30, 2017. Recent reports indicate continued government targeting of defenders inside and outside the country. We note with further alarm the increase in arbitrary arrests and other measures to prevent civil society from organizing peaceful protests. We ask the Council to urge South Sudan to ensure a halt to all human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, torture, and indiscriminate violence against defenders, and to carry out prompt, impartial, and independent investigations of all reported cases, holding suspected perpetrators accountable in fair trials. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Advocates for Human Rights.
Madam President, the Advocates for Human Rights thanks the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan for its oral update. We welcome ongoing efforts to respond to sexual and gender-based violence in South Sudan. The Advocates for Human Rights joins the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty in commemorating World Day Against the Death Penalty on October 10th. This year's theme is Women Sentenced to Death, an Invisible Reality. On Monday, we submitted a report to the CDOC committee highlighting the plight of the 10 women who have been sentenced to death in South Sudan since 2014. As we mark World Day Against the Death Penalty, we call on the Council and the Commission to uphold their commitments to ensure that South Sudan upholds the rule of law and does not arbitrarily sentence people to death. In this regard, we point to a groundbreaking study by the Cornell Center for the Death Penalty worldwide, concluding that women who are, quote, sentenced to death are subjected to multiple forms of gender bias, unquote. For example, most women are sentenced to death for the crime of murder, but such crimes often involve the killing of family members who perpetrate gender-based violence. Women are sentenced to death due to accusations related to conduct that does not conform to expected gender roles. We call on the government of South Sudan to ensure that all judges receive comprehensive training in gender-based discrimination, domestic violence, and tactics of coercive control that may lead to women committing death-eligible offenses. We further call on the Commission and Council to support technical assistance to this end. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was the last speaker on my list of non-government organizations. I will now again give the floor to Eritrea to see whether we have sound this time. Eritrea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation takes note of the report of the Commission of Inquiry on South Sudan and the work accomplished with the cooperation of the Unity of South Sudan government. A fundamental issue that needs serious consideration is the continued peace and security as opposed to the challenges that continue to face the government. In this regard, the Commission needs to consider the objective context, needs, and human betterment ideals and efforts undertaken by South Sudan, so that the country and people benefit from the recommendations of the Commission. In the prevailing situation of the COVID-19 pandemic and attendant challenge, South Sudan is faced with additional challenges like any other country, but progress in the peace and security section is promising. Madam President, accordingly, the necessary space and the time to fully operate and nurture its justice system, laying a favorable ground for comprehensive rehabilitation efforts and encourage the return of those displaced within the country and in neighboring countries. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the Deputy High Commissioner for her concluding remarks.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me start by extending my very deep appreciation, first of all, to the commissioners for the important work that has been accomplished so far, obviously with the invaluable support of the government of South Sudan. I'm also encouraged by the participation of the member states who have spoken today and the NGOs in this enhanced interactive dialogue. I thank them for their statements and questions, as well as for their expressions of support to this critical transition. As I have indicated earlier, the human rights situation in the country remains extremely worrying, and I reiterate my call, therefore, on the government to intensify efforts to address systemic causes of violence, to disband and disarm all armed groups and militias, to conduct prompt, impartial and effective investigations into allegations of violations and abuse, and to hold all those responsible accountable in order to ensure that victims have access to redress. And while I welcome the steps taken by the government to hold perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence accountable, more needs to be done. The cycle of impunity has to stop in order that healing can take place. One concrete step in the fight against impunity, the setting up of the hybrid court for South Sudan, is still a long way from actually becoming operational. The court, of course, by itself is not sufficient, and the international community should support South Sudan to have properly functioning law enforcement. We have all noted the tangible progress in implementing the 2018 revitalized agreement. However, I remain deeply concerned about the slow pace in establishing transitional justice mechanisms. To that end, support from regional and international partners, including the African Union, will be crucial to fully and swiftly implementing the agreement and establishing vital governance and security institutions in order to implement accountability and transitional justice mechanisms, as we highlighted. In the context of the upcoming elections, I would also like to note that the government should encourage inclusive political dialogue and refrain from any undue action that may curtail the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms of any individual, upholding the rights to express views, as these rights are essential to maintaining an inclusive, peaceful, and resilient society, thereby creating conditions for free, fair, transparent, and credible elections. Finally, I wish to assure you that following the adoption of the 2 resolutions on South Sudan by this Council in March of this year, duplication of efforts has largely been avoided through close coordination and a strong relationship between the Commission, UNMISS, and the OHCHR. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Chair of the Commission, Ms. Yasmin Suka, for her concluding remarks.
Madam President, my colleague Andrew Clapham will deal with one question, and then I will make concluding remarks. Andrew?
Thank you, Madam President. We've been asked about the link between corruption and economic, social and cultural rights. The problem of corruption is well known. The president of South Sudan himself has referred to a missing $4 billion. In our view, that money could and should have been used for hospitals and schools. Furthermore, the missing money is being used to foment conflict by supplying arms to local actors who continue with localized violence, as explained in our statement. This in turn leads to further violations of the right to life. So for us, there is a direct link between the missing money, the money which goes on corruption, and the violation of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the right to life. Our report goes into details of corruption and highlights where the money has ended up. The UN Convention on Corruption has created obligations for states, parties outside of South Sudan to repatriate that money and investigate the offences. In this way, those funds would be available to the government of South Sudan to be used to fulfill the economic, social, and cultural rights of the people of South Sudan. We're also asking that senior officials in South Sudan make written declarations regarding their assets when they enter government service, in accordance with Section 35 of the Southern Sudan Anti-Corruption Act of 2009. We feel that some of these steps would lead to an improvement in the enjoyment of the economic, social, and cultural rights of the people of South Sudan. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for the opportunity. As you know from the in South Sudan, as perpetrators know, they can commit these violations and there will be no accountability. We need to remember that Chapter 5 was carefully constructed by the African Union as a comprehensive, holistic program which includes a hybrid court, a truth commission, and a compensation and reparations authority. The hybrid court is critical for criminal accountability for those who have grave responsibility. The Truth Commission is critical to understanding root causes, and the Reparations Commission is important in terms of acknowledging the harm for victims. It is absolutely critical that the reconstituted national legislature authorizes the signing of the MOU to enable the African Union to establish the court. The Commission will, in the next few weeks, release an advisory on how to hold inclusive participatory consultations on the transitional justice agenda. In terms of Chapter 5 of the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan. In our view, unless impunity is addressed, unfortunately, the ongoing cycles of violence will not be interrupted, and South Sudan may be plunged into a greater level of violence. As we can see, 9 of the 10 states already are experiencing ongoing conflict. I thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Rudin Madol Arok Kochul, Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs of South Sudan, for his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Well, I have heard a lot of concerns about the human rights situation in South Sudan. But I think the most important concern that I'll take away from here is the concern that not only the government of South Sudan, not only the Commission for South Sudan, but the whole of international community believes that the only way to resolve the problems of human rights and others in South Sudan is to implement the revitalized agreement. In that regard, the government is willing to discuss the details of these concerns with the Commission and with those others who have expressed their concern. The issue for the people of South Sudan is that they have pinned their hopes on the implementation of this agreement. And therefore, it should not just be monitoring the human rights situation and reporting about the human rights situation. It needs much more than that. Let's all join hands, come to South Sudan, where the people of South Sudan are, where the government of South Sudan are. Let's discuss the details in a way that will help all of us implement the revitalized agreement. Thank you.
I thank you. This brings us to the end of this enhanced interactive dialogue. I wish to thank all of the presenters for their participation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. for the interactive dialogue with the Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, followed by the interactive dialogue with the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi. I hereby close the 17th meeting of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council.